Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Business Karaoke Podcast. Today, we are very lucky we have a special guest. His name is Peter Rogers. Peter, for the people that don't know you, can you just introduce a little bit about what you do right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Peter Rogers and I look after the additive manufacturing technologies at Autodesk. So again, additive manufacturing, most people have question marks above their head. In layman's terms, it's 3D printing, but taken to more of a manufacturing level. So no longer just the plastic parts that most people generally attribute to 3D printing, like these little bad boys.
Okay, Peter is just currently holding up something that looked like a dog from Game of Thrones.
That's correct. And moving more into very high-end metal parts that are used for very, high efficiency heat transistors and also using more lightweighting technologies. So various different methods, but that's kind of what we do with additive manufacturing. The position at Autodesk looks after the whole of APAC. So even though I'm based out of Tokyo, I look after pretty much everything between India and New Zealand. And yeah, pretty much just focused on the way that we can help customers to achieve new and better solutions by using additive.
Thank you so much, Peter. So the reason why I was so keen to have you on the Business Karaoke Podcast is for a few reasons. So the Business Karaoke Podcast exists to talk about all things innovation, particularly in Japan, but also in the wider APAC region. And secondly, to make or to share stories from people who either work in innovation or new industries in Japan. And so we can share those stories with others, particularly other global professionals who might even, through inspiration of your stories and other stories, might even begin to see Tokyo as that real international city that we know it to be. So before we get too much into everything else, and I've got thousands of questions for you about innovation and what it's like to work in Japan. Before that, let's go back a little while. So you and I have actually had the pleasure of knowing each other for more than 10 years now because we studied together. So why don't we go back a little bit and we talk a little bit about where you're from and how your relationship to Japan came to be in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, we both grew up in Melbourne, in Australia. So, and yeah, I think I was doing the calculations. I think it's been like 12 years that we've known each other. So I grew up in Melbourne, always lived in Melbourne, haven't really had a chance to move around when I was a kid, but I was lucky enough when I turned, I think it was about 15, I was offered a scholarship to go on exchange to Japan for 3 months. And that was just during the high school break. So I had a little bit of exposure then. I lived in just outside of Nagoya. So I went to high school for 3 months there, and that was well before I could speak any Japanese. So it was more of a homestay, a bit of a cultural experience. But at the point that I was at, I wasn't really able to keep up with much of the Japanese that was going on. So I did have a bit of exposure and, started to really enjoy the culture and started to really find some amazing people that started to have influences on my life. So I continued to aspire to improve my Japanese abilities. And quite a lot of the people that, I was building out relationships didn't have great English. So what I would be...
Japanese.
Yeah, exactly. But, it was one of those things. They didn't have great English and I wanted to be able to converse with them. I wanted to build out better relationships. So it kind of gave me a really good motivation to continue my Japanese studies. So after going back to Australia, then I continued with the studies further. I did high school 2 years, VCE, and then did Japanese at university, which is where we met.
Right.
So that's kind of where I am in terms of Japanese language studies. We were also together.
Just quickly, was there anything in particular for you that was like, yes, even though, you didn't speak Japanese as well as when you first went to Nagoya, but you were like, you know what, there's something about this. You mentioned it was the people, but was that really the driving force behind you continuing that, not only just being let's say, a passion project or something that you wanted to do, but really transitioning that and taking Japanese and thinking, actually, this is something that I want to make a fundamental building block of my life?
Yeah, so I mean, most of it was people related. I think you're also quite similar, but we're somewhat of a foreigner within the foreigner community, because we didn't really kind of start learning Japanese because we were super into anime or manga, which is...
I thought of this. That's 100%
Yeah.
correct. Yes.
I always feel like a bit of a gaijin within the Gaikokujin community, because it's like everyone's talking about what's your favorite anime, you know, who's your favorite character?
Never seen it.
Pikachu, like, and I only really know that from the games, like.
I love that.
But so yeah, so I didn't really have that kind of driving force where I was like, I really want to understand what they're talking about in the anime in the native language. But it was more around, you know, the people are super friendly. I built out great relationships. I wanted to be able to converse with them better. But the other thing was that I was interested in studying international business. And that had always been a passion of mine. It's what I wanted to do in university. And of course, if I'm looking at doing international business, one of the key drivers of success there would also be around language.
Right.
So in order to kind of differentiate myself, I guess, from the group of graduates that I was going to be competing with when searching for jobs, I thought having a additional language, especially for Australia, you know, Japan is one of our key trading partners. So there is a lot of work that happens between Australia and Japan. And again, if you speak the language, it makes things a lot easier. So, but that was also a motivation. You know, I was looking at the career. I, like most high school students, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wouldn't be at a loss for speaking a different language. So that was also one of the key drivers.
And it's funny, it's exactly as you said. Many people say, well, you know, when we talk about, oh, you know, they ask, oh, you work in Japan? I say yes. And they say, you speak Japanese? And I say yes. And they always look bamboozled. Why? You know, and exactly as you said, Japan is actually a really important trading partner for Australia. And, you know, you and I even had, you know, exposure to Japanese even in our high school years. So the same way in Japan they learn English, or in America they might learn Spanish or another language. Yeah, that was definitely our experience. So talk me a little bit about how Japan and Japanese started transitioning from, I love this, you know, these are the, you know, I'm starting to build relationships with people. It's what I want to do in my life. This is what I want to do with my career. Talk to me a little bit about that beginning phase of it becoming your career. So when did you kind of move from that graduation phase to kind of first jobs in Japan and things like that? Because this is many people's, you know, huge questions. How do I get a job in Japan? How do I just not end up being an English teacher? So let's open this Pandora's box of not exactly where you are now, because, you know, we've got a lot of content to cover before then, but those initial phases, those initial steps. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that people do when they first come to Japan. And, you know, I've done a little bit of English teaching as well. Like, I think everyone's kind of done a little bit of tutoring. It's great money on the side. And to be honest, it's pretty easy. Like, as long as you're not doing, you know, like thorough curriculum building and taking responsibility for the education. But if you're doing like eikaiwa or something like that, you know, you're pretty much getting paid to just go have coffee and speak in English and kind of give a little bit of advice. So it's kind of fun, and it can actually help for a bit of transition of knowledge as well, not just from you, but you know, it's also a relatively good way to learn a little bit about the way that, you know, the mind works in Japanese, which can then also help you to further your abilities in learning that language. So I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. And to be honest, most people start there. And one of the reasons for that is just because it's incredibly difficult to get a job in Japan outside of Japan. So most companies, you'll maybe have a good conversation with them. They'll be interested in what you do, and they'll say, yeah, okay, well, you look really good on paper. We're very interested in you. This is sounding very good. Let us know when you move to Japan and we can think about the interview. And it's like, well, you're asking in one basket, not have a job when I get over there, and to invest a lot of money in actually making the move, getting an apartment,
And
all
often
of
you
that
can't
sort
get
of
an
stuff.
apartment without a job. So then you open
Exactly.
this, catch 22 as well.
Exactly.
And I think that point, and, for those people that are either, years in Japan, decades in Japan, or even just at the beginning of their career, learning how Japanese people communicate with you in English is an absolute window to not only language, the Japanese language, but also like the Japanese mindset as well. So I'm definitely want to make sure that those people listening to us really do pick up that point, because that is definitely step number one in learning Japanese or the Japanese culture, is understanding how they're communicating with you first. So we start, okay, so you decided, how did you first get there? What was your first, when you said, okay, I'm moving? Did you move without a job, and then, or how did that work for you?
So I was pretty proactive in trying to figure out how to do this. So what I did was I was working with a company in Sydney, and that was digital marketing. I had built up a good kind of platform for myself within the company there. We had offices in the US and in Europe.
I was just going to ask, just quickly, can you give us a little bit of an idea about this company? Was it purely Australian? Was it global? Did they have an office in Japan?
Yeah, so it was purely Australian owned. So it was a relatively rare company. It was a digital advertising company that had offices in the US and in Europe, but it was all of the C-levels were in Sydney. And I was working directly with them, building out a relatively good success base for myself. But then, getting to the point, we didn't really have any offices in Asia, which was a massive untapped market. So I positioned myself so that I built out a use case. I built out a reason why we would go there. The business case was looking solid. And I presented it to our management to try and get sign off on them sending me to Japan and creating the office for them. So I moved here with that company, and I was continuing to do the exact same thing that I was doing in Australia, just collaborating, building out more publishers, building out more advertisers within the Japanese market. Right. So I did my initial move by creating success overseas. And I get a lot of people that kind of come up to me and they're saying, hey, I'm going to graduate, next year. Once I graduate, I want to move to Japan and start my career. I probably wouldn't necessarily suggest that's a great idea.
Can you tell me?
I like, from quite a lot of the experience that I've seen, people generally find a lot more success when they've had exposure to the working environment in their own country first. Being in Japan, working in Japan, learning another language, it's difficult enough, as well as then on top of that, having the stress of, this is my first job.
Being young, being junior, right?
Exactly. And especially within Japan, the class system is massive, right? So, you've got your senpai and kohai, and there's a massive gap between where you would want to be heading for you to be successful as an individual within a company and where you would be starting. So most people that are from overseas, the greatest value that they bring to the company is either a unique skill set or English. One of the first things that kind of changed in my head when I started finding new roles in Japan and starting interviewing with some of these companies was, it's kind of like, Tokcho wa nan desu ka? What are some of your strengths? And, originally, when I was dumb and young, I would be saying, oh yeah, Japanese and communication skills. And you're kind of like, well, yeah, but the people that I'm going up against are Japanese, so they've probably got Japanese down pat, right? Like, it's like, yeah, I'm going up against 30 Japanese people for this role, and I'm saying that one of my strengths is Japanese. That doesn't really translate, right?
Right.
But then as you go in and you're kind of like, well, I'm native English speaker, so I can assist with global sales. I can do this, I can do that. That makes it a lot, even though it seems like incredibly simple, and that of course you speak English, you're a white person. There is like literally nothing that tells me that you don't speak English. Sorry, that doesn't, like everyone would expect me to speak English, but having Japanese as, of course, the base, that's one of the things that helped me to transition as well.
Absolutely. I think there's 2 points that you brought up that I think is absolutely key. The first one is that just because you want it doesn't mean anybody else thinks it's valuable or that it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So when you were in Sydney and you thought, you know what, I really think that, you know, this is maybe an opportunity for me to, you know, start building my path to Japan. And I think we haven't even spoken about patience, but I'm sure that'll come up, you know, in our conversation as well. And understanding that it's not this kind of, you know, YOLO decision making. I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to go to Japan. That's not it. It's more this, okay, how can I build step by step, brick by brick today, my path to Japan in a way that's both beneficial for me as a person, but also for my organization. And I think doing things like spending your time investing in a business plan, building a business case, things like this, even if the business case or the business plan, it doesn't come off as you'd originally imagined, you're showing your bosses or you're showing your management you're very serious about this. And putting in the research is super, super important as well. And then again, mentioning about that, you know, when you are passionate about something, you know, and to move to Japan, you have to have a level of passion. Otherwise, it's just too hard. It's just really too hard. And we often say, you know, what makes us special is Japanese, but we're thinking in our Australian minds, which is that was what made us special. But we have to remember, hang on a second, take a step back. We're not in Australia anymore. We're in Japan. So whatever my skill set was in Australia is now directly opposite in Japan. So Australia, I know Asia, I speak Japanese, I can be a bridge, I can be all these things. And then when I'm in Japan, okay, let's flip these, you know, unique selling propositions on the head. Now I speak English, I'm an international person, you know, and that's kind of the way forward.
Understand the international global markets, it's going to be great. I can communicate and deal with all of the issues that we're having with our international clients in English.
Exactly. Okay, and so we started changing how you were speaking to getting jobs, and was this more successful?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that it wasn't just the flip between I speak Japanese to I speak English, but it was also a flip of what would they expect from me, or what would I be presenting to them as value? So, and that's always massive. Like if you can't go into an interview and have a solid value proposition, everyone else has got probably a better value proposition. So understanding and thinking about what your customers are doing, you know, like even if it's just doing basic research. I mean, I was kind of lucky because I had a bit of a finance background. So I would like look through some of their annual reports and I would say, you know what, I see that the results of your international business division are going down. I would love to have a, you know, input how we improve that. Otherwise, if you're divesting from that, then let's just wrap up this interview now.
Right.
And quite a lot of the time they'd be like, yeah, well, we're not divesting. So it's actually something that we're quite focused on trying to fix. So if you can actually go in, understand some of their issues by doing a little bit of research, presenting value that, you know, you can have to that company, that starts to become the key, right? And just kind of flipping it on its head, exactly as you said, you know, don't think about it how you can benefit from this. Think about what you can offer to coming to Japan, right?
Right. And I love this point because we haven't even spoken about language yet, right? We haven't even spoken about language yet. What this is really about being a global professional and being proactive in building your career. And of course, speaking Japanese helps building your career, but that's really just one part of it. And this whole mindset of how can I bring value? And this is probably even stronger because this is not the way many Japanese people walk into interviews, let alone foreign people. I think the idea of what can I do, what kind of opportunities can I bring, and especially the Japanese recruiting process this is the job that we have, find this person who can do these skills, right? You're coming in and you're saying, actually, let's take a business lens and let's talk about what kind of business opportunities we have, and then let's find the people. So this is even a new idea in itself.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of comes back to quite a lot of the issues that we're talking about around innovation, around solution driving, you know, selling value as opposed to selling function. Right. And that's one of the things, you know, you don't go in talking about one of my strengths is language. It's like, well, what does that tool allow you to achieve? And how does that translate to business advantage for them as a person that is potentially going to hire you, right?
Absolutely.
But more importantly than that, exactly as you say, we're not talking specifically about language here, but if you can do this well, it's not just success in Japan, right? Like, this is a global thought, if you can do this in Japan, you can also do it in Australia. If I wanted to move across to Europe and I implement the same methodology, it's just good business practice, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. So as we move forward,
quite a lot of the time, like, we find, well, especially from my experience, I found a lot of people that have come across to Japan and have been working here, of course, depending on the different industries that they're working in, but especially for English teachers, they go back to their home country and it's like, wait a tick. They're like, I'm going to go back to my home country and get a really good job and kind of, get out of this English teaching
cycle.
Exactly. That's the word I was after. The cycle that you generally fall in. But it's like, well, the last 12 years you've been working in Japan doing English teaching. So when you're going to the US or the European job market, it's like, well, you've got pretty high competition, right? Like, there's not too much English teaching that you can do over there, and those that do will generally need degrees and masters and these sort of things, and it's potentially not the skill set that is currently owned. But that's exactly the same with other industries as well. Like, if you have built out great success in very, very niche things in the Japanese market, and that only exists in the Japanese market, then you're going to have a very difficult time finding a decent job or kind of trying to build out that business for yourself overseas. So understanding and creating this mindset of just figuring out companies' pain points, figuring out ways to offer value, and then communicating that effectively, that's pretty much the three things that are going to help you to succeed pretty much anywhere, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when people get a little bit stuck, when they think, what have I been doing? I've been English teaching, or I've been working in sales, or I've been working in marketing. Zoom out a second and think about, how did you spend your day? Well, actually, I spent 95% of my day talking to people and negotiating and things like that. So there are translatable skills that people can pick up. One thing that people are always very interested to know is, talk us through a little bit about your transition into a Japanese company and working in that very much Japanese environment. So let's begin there, when you are, in the world of Kaisha.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of got an interesting kind of background. So I worked at one company that was Japanese as a international business director. So it was kind of like working with a very Japanese style company, but going overseas. Whereas now I'm working for a global company and focusing more on the Asian market. So previously I was not looking at Japan. That was like the only country that wasn't part of the scope of my work. But now it's very much focused on Japan and working with customers that are in Japan. And I'm kind of glad that I did it that way, because I could build up my understanding of how Japanese people think, the culture of doing business, while not having it directly tied to my KPIs.
Right.
So by doing it that way, I've got all this experience with Japanese culture, but then I've also kind of taken that to the next role where I can start to implement that into working with Japanese customers.
So let's take that and go deeper. Tell me what those things are, because people are always what they're doing.
And so it's always quite interesting. Like, the companies that I've worked at, they've generally had a bit more of a foreign presence than some of the other companies that are in Japan. So I haven't worked for a more like a super Japanese company. They've generally had a little bit of international influence. They've generally been a little bit more cutting edge, so a little bit more forward thinking in the way that they do business. So I can't kind of talk about, the super Japanese companies, but I do work with them. That's my customer base at the moment, so I know exactly where they're coming from. In terms of the things that were interesting for me, and some of the things that were, a little bit more challenging, was quite a lot of the time, especially for the foreign markets and these sort of things, they tend not to take the experience and implement that into the vision or the strategy, but they kind of create this strategy and they're like, take this to the global market, which has its challenges because quite a lot of the time it's a strategy that's potentially very, very suitable for the Japanese market. But as soon as you take it overseas, it just crumbles. You know, there's not really a
Because it's built on the Japanese infrastructure. It's built in the idea that this works in Japan, this is the way society works, this is the way our banking system works, and then you just copy and paste that, and actually the infrastructure abroad, despite us all being human and that connecting us, etc., banking systems are different, tax is different,
Exactly. So having a look at, you know, opening up the hood, right? Trying to figure out what this engine looks like. Quite a lot of the time it was like, it needs to be highly localized, especially when you're trying to take it out of Japan. But yeah, so I think that quite a lot of the time there is kind of like a weird kind of gap between the Japanese and the foreign staff. Doesn't really matter which company, who I speak with, there's always that slight kind of them against us in some aspects.
Right. On both sides as well, though, right? I found it on both sides.
Absolutely. So I think that it's always quite tricky to get full integration within a company, but you know, I think that there are a number of ways to get around it. And while language is one way to kind of get through it, I think just being inclusive, being part of it, is trying to get involved in the decision making also kind of helps to show that, you know, we're not just here on a working holiday where we're going to be like out the door in 1 year, but it's like we want to actually help to influence the decision making so that we can try and improve the business case for the international market as well.
Absolutely. There's this idea that I've heard a few people say, there's a level of distrust if you're foreign in Japan, because they think that you're going to just leave, you know?
There is a little bit of that, for sure.
There's I guess two huge driving factors behind that. One is Japan is a place where you don't really have a strict career path, right? You join a company. Obviously things are changing now. However, you join a company rather than a job, right? So it's not you know, you do this job and then I can progress through my career. That's not really it. It's I join Nissan, I join name whichever Toyota, whichever other Japanese company you want to work for. And the other idea behind it is also that I find there's real opportunity also for foreigners to or maybe there's a challenge between private and professional lives, right? So you kind of just adopt your friends at work. You're just supposed to be friends with them, you know, things like that. So I've had a few experiences in my life where I've been invited to my clients' children's sports days and things like this, you know, which is where people would think that's crazy, you know. However, the idea is, you know, in Japan there's this idea of you know, work-life balance, right? But work-life balance doesn't mean my life is over, you know, one side and my work is on the other side. It's they're equally good. They're equally in balance, right? And so what maybe someone could do if they're in a Japanese company and they're trying to build those relationships, they're trying to build that trust, is to even zoom out a little bit and use the grayness of Japan to their advantage. So instead of, you know, if you can't speak Japanese but you're very good at photography, maybe you can start like a bukatsu, like in your a lunchtime club thing where people come and talk about photography and, you know, things like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that's trying to share some of your interests, trying to not have them focus on foreigner, but more focus on, hey, this person's a camera person, you know, or like this person loves tennis, so they've got like a you know, bukatsu happening with their team, with their company every Saturday, you know, like things like that can help. But again, I think that one of the reasons why Japan has some challenges, I guess, as well, is because there's not really, like, I mean, especially from Australia, like 5 o'clock out the door, going, spending time with family, all these sort of things. So one of the things that can be challenging is if you move to Japan as a couple or as like a married couple and you're used to a certain lifestyle, expect that to be completely flipped, right? Especially, you know, as you were talking about, you know, there's the work side of things, but then there's also the social side of work, and that might be finishing up at 8 p.m. and then your butcher is like, let's go out for drinks, or
Right.
you know, we're going to go out and we've got to do this, we're going to try and figure out what's happening here over drinks. And quite often it's just kind of like, I need to get home, like
Right. How do you manage, how have you managed that, or how have you seen people in your circle manage that? And because I think that is a real challenge for some people, because they think, okay, I want to prioritize my work, and especially you know, I think it's less, and we're moving away from an expat model, you know, that where people go for 2 years and then leave. I think there are some people that really do want to move to Japan and build a life there and build a career there. So they're thinking long term. So they're thinking, okay, I want to say no. How do I manage that though?
Yeah, exactly. So it's tricky, right?
Yeah, there's no right. And again, we're doing this not because we have the right answers, which is exactly as you mentioned when we started talking about this on LinkedIn to others. We're not doing this for because we have answers. We're doing this because think about 10 years ago when you and I began our careers in Japan, there was zero data, there was zero content for foreigners like us. You know, the foreigner in Japan was the 40-year-old expat, 2 kids, goes with your spouse, you know, and that was kind of the person in Japan. There was none of this young, you know, youngish global professionals. That didn't exist. So the stories that we're sharing now are not gospel. They're simply experiences. So
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's not advice either. It's literally just, this is my experience. Take from it what you want.
Yeah.
Ignore everything else. But yeah, so I mean, kind of getting back to your point around some of the issues around trust and that sort of thing within Japanese companies, you know, a lot of the more traditional companies, even if it was like a international business trip or something, it'll be like, oh, we can only send 2 people to this event. So we're going to send, okay, Peter, you can go, and we're going to send this Japanese person as well. And quite a lot of the time, it was like literally just like you're sending that person as a babysitter sort of thing. Like they're not contributing at all to any of the way that the event is run. They're not going to have a positive influence on how we're having communications with them.
They're not a subject matter expert. They can't speak English.
Yeah, it's like that person literally just wants to come to kind of get a bit of it's not a shucho, it's a ryoko, you know, it's like, it's not a business trip, it's just a trip.
Holiday.
Yeah, exactly. They're getting a bit of a holiday out of it. So, so I guess that kind of like is a foreigner and having that experience where it's like, what does that person coming, like this person would be 1,000 times more beneficial to come with me because we could do twice the amount of meetings. They're native at English. Oh yeah, no, but we want to send a Japanese person as well. And it's like, well, it's like,
tell me about that.
Like,
bring it up. How do you navigate that conversation? Do you wave a flag? Like, what do? Do you flag it?
Yeah, no, like, I mean, to be honest, sometimes you just need to kind of call it out, right? Just be like, we don't really need a babysitter. We need results. And depending on who's in the meeting, like if there's, for example, like one of the C-level people, they're kind of like, yeah, what the hell are you saying? Why do you need somebody to go? We're spending money so that we can get results on the board. I like this guy because he's actually thinking about our baseline, right? If we're not looking at what this meeting is meant to have in terms of ROI for the company, then why are we going, right? So I think that depending on the audience, it can be somewhat valuable to be calling it out. But then, of course, Japan, you know, the nail that sticks out gets out. So you don't want to cause too much trouble, and you need to kind of be very political in the way that you do it. But, you know, sometimes you just have to call it out. And one of the things that I also, piece of advice number 2, you're a foreigner, be a foreigner, you know.
I second that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how Japanese you try and be. You're not Japanese. You're never going to be looked upon as a Japanese person, and you're never going to do it well. So it doesn't
you're
like...
going to do you well. If you go and be, you know, whatever you are, you're going to do that really great.
Exactly. And the other thing is, there are so many times where you're kind of like, oh, Peter, gaijin dakara dekita ne. It's like, you can do it because you're a foreigner. And it's like, yeah, actually, to be honest, a Japanese person probably couldn't get away with this with a customer, you know, like they would try and be overly apologetic. And it's like, yeah, no, wait, hold on. Let's just kind of balance the expectations here. And that can be a very difficult confrontational conversation for a Japanese person. But if we kind of come across, it's kind of like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand, you know? And
So tell me a little
So
bit about how to navigate that sea. So what are some things that we should keep in mind? So I can only second your advice in be who you are. You know, you and I, being young and being really shaped in Japan. You know, we had so many formative years in Japan that there's a lot of it. You know, is definitely built into our personality, but also it's not all of our personality. So what I've found is leveraging both. You know, both those people who you are, you know, and some people are, you know, even trilingual or whatever. So it's to leverage all those different parts of you. So tell me a little bit about how, if you were to sit down with yourself like 10 years ago, or even for someone who's moving to Japan now and say, okay, if you're going to navigate the Japanese management system or just work in Japan, here's some things to keep in mind. So obviously those two that you mentioned, but are there anything else specifically maybe about that management relationship?
So the management relationship is always an interesting one, right? So even at the moment, I can guarantee that some of the management level people within the company look at me as kind of a difficult person. And I mean, I don't disagree with them, you know, like, to be honest, I see that as one of the key traits that I'm actually bringing value. You know, I'm not just a yes man. I'm a let's sit back, let's have a look at the value of the thing that we're looking at for the company. And I'm happy to call it as it is, right? And I think that that's one of the things that is very rare in some of the Japanese organizations. Don't get me wrong, there are some people that call it out heaps. So it's not just me, that's for sure. But having that ability and being in that position where you can just be like, yeah, I don't think that this is right. Let's review this. And being able to back it up, you know, actually saying, well, these are the reasons why I don't think this is suitable, can really drive your self-branding within the company. And once you have a decent brand built up, I think that you can really start to kind of explore that a bit further, and you can start to move into more management positions. And I mean, from my position at the moment, I think that there is a lot of value in being in Japan within a global company,
Right.
because a lot of the decision making, a lot of the development, a lot of the stuff that's happening is going to be done overseas. So if you're in that position where you get all of the most up-to-date information, you're reading the email outs, you know, all of the
company newsletter, all that stuff, the press releases.
Exactly. So you can actually, like, even within one of the larger offices that we have, which is the Japan office for the company I'm working at now, you know, that communication with the international offices really puts me in a high standpoint, because I know quite a lot of what's happening within the company before everyone else. So if there's something that's happening, you know, I'll kind of grab some of the key points and I'll feed that back to the team. And I'll be like, hey guys, you might have missed it in the newsletter, but this is something that we should all be looking at. They start to kind of look at me as more of a, not a trusted advisor. I don't want to use that term that loosely, but kind of as somebody that's a source of knowledge. So quite a lot of the time it'll be like, hey Peter, do we have anything around this? Even though it's not something that I do, it might just be that I've overheard, or there was like one sentence in the 3-hour
webinar or whatever it was,
webinar, the release or the training that we've just done, and they're like, I might have missed something, and it's like, oh yeah, this was blah 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 blah. And
one thing that I think on this is super important is that you said feeding it back to the team, right? And so this is when the self-branding within the company, you've got actually two brands. One is you as a professional, and the second one for me is you as a team player. How Team Japan are you? Right? Is also something that I found. So when you can translate that you being a foreigner is an advantage for your Japanese team, because you use your foreigner magic and English magic or whatever it is that you do, and you translate it. Like I've had many similar experiences to you, as you know, you pick up something in a brief, you've spoken to someone, you've even just heard something on the news that's not, you know, spoken about in Japan, because Japan, you get different news than you do abroad, you know, and then you might, you know, bring it up in a meeting and people are, you know, think that you're from the future. So I found that building two brands, one as being a professional and the other being that, you know, I'm here you can trust me, I'm a friend, you know, don't see my foreigner as, you know, me being a foreigner as a challenge or an obstacle to overcome, you know, think about it that actually I can bring value to the team. So I think that's really great as well.
And I mean, just to kind of like put it, even just to kind of expand on that as well, like the way that you are self-branding internally kind of works two ways, right? So you're the source of all English information for a lot of people within the company in Japan, but you're also a source of Japanese information for a lot of the global companies. So building out your brand, not only with the Japan team, but also kind of making sure that people in the global team know that you're the person to get in contact with anything to do with Japan, right? That's exactly what I do at the moment. It's, hey, Peter, we want to work with a Japanese company. We've got this automotive stuff that we're working on. Which company can we do it with? You know, this project, who can we collaborate with?
Right.
And being able to then take that information and be like, okay, well, there's this opportunity over abroad. Let's bring in one of our Japanese account managers. We can have a bit of a discussion around it.
Mm-hmm.
So collaborating not only with information brought from outside in, but also then looking at exporting some of that information that the Japan team is building on is great. And one of the reasons that that's quite important is because the management are potentially not that great at conveying the successes that they've had, you know, of course, depending on the person, but, you know, they're not necessarily going out there to try
culture is still very driver.
Yeah, exactly. They're very modest, right? So they're not going to be overstating their success stories, but, you know, especially as a foreigner, I can get in there and I can be like, well, you know, he said like maybe 10% of what that success story is about. Guys, you really need to pay attention to this because these are the things that were amazing in this case. These are the reasons why it translated to great value for our customers and all these sort of things. And the reason why that's valuable is because, again, the foreign team wants to know a bit more granularity about what's happening in the Japanese market. It's for, you know, for Autodesk, it's one of our largest sources of revenue for the company globally. So if we can better figure out how we're being successful in Japan and translate that to some of the things that we're doing abroad, that's also a massive win.
So let's take this win analogy. Because I've seen time and time again that across industry, it doesn't matter where the global headquarter is, this is the story. Japan is doing well. It's our number one performer in APAC. However, we have no idea why. I don't think even anyone in the company has an email address. Like this is kind of, obviously that's a little bit overstated, but the idea that Japan is this kind of black box of success that people go, okay, well, it's working, so let's not touch it, right? Whereas we're, you know, on the other side saying, actually, if you unbox it and we learn, there's really a lot in there, which kind of brings me a little bit to our conversations, like around innovation. Yeah. So if we can start talking a little bit about how we can bring that, you know, and this is one of the reasons why I think your input is so valuable, is because we have this real double mindset. This is why I'm really interested in talking to people that equally love working in Japan, but equally hate it, you know, and equally love working abroad, but equally things drive them crazy, you know, because I think that gives a real honest conversation. So one thing, you know, you and I came together and we have had many conversations about is, you know, processes, things like design thinking and stuff like that. So let's kind of open a little bit the world of innovation. Japan, we've known kind of where Japan was. We're in a very unique situation now, COVID-19, you know, things like, you know, working from home in Japan for many people is a disaster because it's, you know, one LDK, you know, you can wash your hands, have a shower and write emails without moving from the couch, you know, all these kind of things. So let's talk a little bit about like Japan in the future, right? What kind of could Japan look like? What can we do? What can global professionals do? What can global companies do to kind of bridge that gap? How can we, you know, share those stories on both sides?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of conflicting kind of feelings around the kind of topic of innovation in Japan. I think that there is a lot of desire to innovate. And a lot of people that I speak to, they're kind of like, this is unacceptable. We need to change it. But then once they start to look at it, it's kind of like, you know, there's a couple of key things in my view. I would kind of put it down to three things. One of them is regulation. Like regulation is so old, and it is just beyond ridiculous how poor the regulation is around certain things. So just not being able to take it to a large scale due to regulations is ridiculous. Of course, there are needs for regulations, you know, safety as well as.
We're talking about they should be up to speed, right? So like, let's
exactly.
regularly regulate.
And
innovate our regulation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things, it's not set in stone, right? It needs to be continuously updated. It needs to be continuously changed. It needs to keep up with the times. But quite a lot of these regulations, you know, they haven't been touched for like 20, 30 years. So that can be challenging. So regulatory environment is very, very tricky for innovation in Japan compared to some of the other countries where regulation is more frequently updated. Number two, I see one of the challenges is what they kind of like say is like shokunin waza, like as in this is a very, very niche talent that only I can do. And one of the things that Japan has done quite well is innovate really, really interesting capabilities, but quite a lot of those capabilities remain in one person, you know. And quite a lot of this aging workforce and quite a lot of these more traditional capabilities are of course fantastic, but that's not getting passed down to generations because quite a lot of these, you know, these shokunin, these, you know, they're almost artisans of their process, aren't turning that process into a scalable process.
Right.
And with the technology that we have today, quite a lot of it can be done, you know, in a more efficient process, but again, they're not wanting to be put out of work. They want to make sure that they're still relevant in today's very difficult, very fast changing society. And if their capability is 100% linked to them, then they're not going to get fired. Like there's no way that they can become irrelevant to the company if they are the only person that can do that thing.
Exactly, I can train people. So before we jump to point 3, I wanted to stay here for one more second, because another thing I found also is that I remember in my very first job in a place called Higashimatsuyama, which I was sold to as Tokyo. It's not, it's Saitama.
It's Saitama, yeah.
I remember there was a guy, like an older gentleman who would go through specific labor law books. And so I had never seen someone actually scan through a book so fast. Like you saw that this man, he is the person for this particular labor law, and he knows exactly where in this, Bible of labor laws it is. And people would say to him, oh, can I help you? I wish I could help you, but nani-nani-sama, you're so, incredibly talented. Yeah, exactly. And so this guy who could have a team actually kind of cannibalized himself out of it because, the social implication was, oh, but I could never do what you're doing, Mitsubishi-san, or whatever your name is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a challenge. The only way that, innovation can happen is by having repeatable, scalable processes. Otherwise, it's just going to be reliant on one person, and that becomes very challenging. But Japan has also developed itself as quite a shokunin waza community, right?
Jiro Sushi, anyone who's seen that movie on Netflix.
Sorry, which one?
Jiro, the sushi guy?
Oh, yeah.
9 years old and won't leave his restaurant. Okay, and so the third point as well.
And the third point, I kind of see it's a slightly more controversial, but I kind of see this whole Japanese thought around Kaizen as one of the biggest barriers for innovation. Okay. And for those that don't know Kaizen, it's kind of like the continuous improvement cycle on the existing. So you've got something, you're improving it, you're taking information, you're feeding that back into the process, you're making it better, you're then taking that better product, getting more feedback on it, making it better. That's great, but it's like, well, where does that kind of reach perfection and, you know, you're getting massively reduced returns on the amount of effort that goes into the next step in the Kaizen process. You know, you're kind of reaching that kind of flat section of the improvement, the product improvement cycle. And quite a lot of the time, you know, that's where we get stuck. You know, we're so stuck in the mindset that this is the way that it's done, you know, like
right. It implies that our start line is okay. It doesn't say,
yeah, exactly.
Let's
exactly.
Step back and review.
Yeah. And I mean, if you went to, if you were trying to create a company like Toyota 200 years ago, and it was like, well, we want to get from A to B as fast as possible. Okay, we've got a horse. Let's give it, you know, steroids. Let's give it a cart. You know, let's make the cart wheels a little bit thicker. You know, let's do these things. But how many cycles of Kaizen would it take for you to turn a horse into a car, right? Like that doesn't happen. So you get to the point where you're just kind of like, well, to be honest, I don't think that this process is the best way from getting to A to B. Let's rethink this. Well, we see that there is this new technology that we could potentially implement that does help us to get from A to B a lot more efficiently.
Right. This actually is huge. This point for me over the last, you know, three years of, you know, working in innovation in Japan. And like you said, you know, I actually began my career in Japan, but I actually had to go abroad. 7 years. I was 7 years in Germany, which is where I built my career in design thinking before I came back to Japan, because I don't think I would have had my innovation career if I had begun in Japan, to be honest. You know, maybe now it might be a little bit different because it's, you know, ideas like innovation and design thinking are still, you know, are more, you know, opening up in Japan, but they're still katakana words, right? And for people that don't know what a katakana word means, it means it's their English made words, you know. Exactly. And I think this point of respecting Japanese manufacturing, you know, policy or methodologies, I think is really important. But at the same time, that idea of if we only focus on Kaizen, we're only ever going to get the best form of what we've already got. And your job and my job is to bring things into the world that maybe don't exist yet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the key, right? If we can come in and deliver something that's a whole new source of revenue for them, you know, it's not, we're keeping ourselves ahead of the competition is of course great, but you know, it's kind of like Nokia, right? They didn't go into smartphones. They continued with the traditional phones. And, you know, they were in the Fortune 500 companies. They were one of the top mobile producers at, you know, the turn of the century. And all of a sudden, you know, within, I think, 5 years, they were completely out of business.
Right. My 6310 battery is still not dead, I'm pretty sure.
I was going to say, my 3310, I didn't turn it off when I put it into the shelf, and it's still going.
It's still going. But this is it. And I think that this is really a way, and people say Japan, forget it, innovation, forget it. But to be honest, I think so much of innovation is relationships. So much of, you know, innovation is that ability to you know, to work in that grayness, that曖昧, you know, that kind of uncertainty. And the Japanese, as much as, you know, they are quite rigid in many things, are very comfortable with ambiguity as well. So I think the cultural pillars of Japan, for me, are very much you know, a thriving ground for innovation. But I do think there is a point that we do have to say there is a place for Kaizen. We're not saying, you know, forget Kaizen, but we're saying when we are in the business of innovation, and it is, as you said, a business of innovation, it's not simply just, you know, for fun and games, but we're thinking about how we can solve new problems, how we can bring new value and uncover hidden value in the world. We're actually, Kaizen's not enough. Because we're going to have to not begin from how can we make this better? We're going to have to begin from do we need it at all? And I remember you actually had an analogy once where you said, okay, we're not starting from zero. Let's actually begin at -10 and see where that even brings us.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it kind of ties into the Luma way of thinking, right? Like, or the design thinking process, which is, you know, this is how we do it today. And, you know, going up the ladder and saying, why? I think that, like, I always kind of think back to my son when I'm kind of looking at the reasons for doing things. And And anybody that has a child, it'll be like, yeah, we're doing this. Why? Oh, because we want to do this. Why? Because it's going to be great for us. Why? Because we want to have a better family. It's like, okay, well, that's what we want to do, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay. But the whole idea of like how things are being done, let's kind of take a couple of steps back, you know, like it's exactly the same with Sony, right? They were creating Discman, and you get to the point where it's like, well, why are we using discs? Like, what is the goal here? We want to create a new way for people to enjoy music. Okay, that's the problem statement, right? And
that's
instead of looking at yeah, and having a look at it and being like, well, okay, well, is carrying around a as much as it was fun carrying around a deck,
I remember carrying CDs in my blazer pocket. I so remember that.
Brittany, we're showing our age.
Sorry, I'll cut that. I'll cut that.
But that's the thing, right? And but kind of getting to your point, and kind of drilling it back to my point, get experience overseas. You know, like innovation is a katakana word, and exactly as you said, innovation is seen as something that is done overseas from Japan, right? Like they do, of course, do some innovation in-house, but they're much better at Kaizen. But I think for one of the ways that we can try and help some of the Japanese customers to kind of get a bit further is kind of creating that mindset of, you know, 20% innovation, 80% Kaizen. I think that's a relatively good balance. And again, one of the reasons is because you need to create that innovation, but you also need to then put that in the hands of the Japanese to let them refine that to the best point.
Absolutely.
And
this is a question that people say. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
They don't necessarily know when to stop. Like
exactly. This is the number one question that I get in our design sprints, in our workshop is, so do I do this for how long? And I'm like, no, we're just working for 5 days. We're going to do a sprint. We'll do it for 5 days. And then after those 5 days, you'll take this idea and then you go and work on it. And then I think that's a real, and I think this comes down to something super simple, and that's practice. We just haven't operated. We don't work in that way as often as we have in Japan. You know, design thinking and innovation in 2020 in Japan is 2014. You know, America or places like that. I've been so lucky to have so much of your time today, and I just wanted to wrap up on a really a positive note, because there's really a reason that you and I believe in innovation in Japan. There's a reason why we live our lives in Japan. There's a reason why, you know, us being teenagers and being crazy, we thought, I want to go to Japan. So why don't some closing words, if you were going to talk a little bit about this journey, and it's been what a journey it's been, Peter, right? What a journey it's been. What are some of your closing words about working in Japan and for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So working in Japan, I think that there are, of course, a huge amount of challenges. But all in all, you know, like there is still a very large workforce of foreigners in Japan. I think that we need to grow the numbers in order to be recognized a bit further. There's a huge amount of frustrations from most of the people that are in their country. You know, like I have a huge expat community around me, and a lot of the time, you know, there's frustrations that are constantly coming up that are resonating across the entire room, right? One person will say, oh, in my company, it's really annoying because blah, blah, blah. And everyone's just nodding, you know?
Nodding, cheers to that, cheers.
But I think that hopefully the working environment will get better, but I think that there needs to be a little bit of push also from the Japan side, and whether it's around visa rights, whether it's around working environments, whether it's around, you know, just basic worker rights, which some of the time are not being effectively met. But I think that that's getting better, like compared to where we were at, you know, 5-10 years ago. I think that the environment has improved. There's still a lot of work to be done, but, you know, we can't do it without more people joining us. So I think that if you are interested in Japan, get in touch with some of the recruiters. They know where to look for your value. They know where the companies that are looking for people like you are going to be evaluating you. But it kind of comes down to confidence as well, right? Like if you know what your value is going to be to that company, then just drive that, you know. It's just figuring out what they're looking for, what that company needs, and then kind of trying to implement it. So build out your capabilities, find something that you're really good at, make sure that it derives value in your home country before bringing it to Japan, just so that you've got that experience. Come in as an expert, because to be honest, nobody wants to be a junior in Japan.
No, and they've got an opportunity more than ever is now to leverage videos, webinars. You can write for every week for 2 years on your experience before you even jump to Japan. So there's so much that people have at their fingertips now. But Pete, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on the Business Karaoke Podcast. And I'm sure that we've achieved our 2 goals, which is 1, to just talk about that innovation ecosystem in Japan. And number 2 is to also share with other global professionals that Japan certainly is a viable option for a career in innovation. So Peter, thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime.
I might take you up on that, Brittany.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.